A small-town diner on a rainy afternoon. A 17-year-old girl sat quietly in the corner, hoping to stay invisible like she always did. But laughter broke the peace when a group of boys turned their attention to her, turning whispers into humiliation, and humiliation into a public spectacle recorded on their phones. No one moved. No one spoke. The room watched as she fell to the floor, alone in the middle of a place full of people. Then the door opened. A former Navy SEAL stepped inside, reins still on his jacket, a German shepherd at his side, eyes scanning the room like he already knew the truth. He didn't ask questions. He asked one thing only. Did they touch you? And in that moment, everything changed. Because this wasn't just bullying. It was something much bigger, hiding behind silence. Before we begin, if you enjoy stories of courage and loyalty, please like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Cold rain pressed against the glass windows of Miller's Diner like restless fingers, blurring the neon sign outside into a smeared glow of red and white that flickered with every passing car. Inside, the air smelled of fried oil, cheap coffee, and the faint sweetness of syrup soaked into old wooden booths, creating a warmth that felt fragile, as if it could break at any moment. Emma Parker sat in her usual corner booth near the back, the one furthest from the front door and closest to the restroom hallway, as if proximity to exits made her feel safer. 17 years old, she had a round, soft face, framed by slightly uneven brown hair, tied loosely in a ponytail, and a body she had long since learned to hide beneath oversized hoodies even in warm weather. She was not simply overweight, as people sometimes cruelly labeled her. She was a girl who had grown up absorbing every glance, every whisper, every laugh that followed her through school corridors. Those years had shaped her into someone who moved quietly, spoke carefully, and always chose invisibility when possible. To Emma, the diner was supposed to be a refuge. No teachers, no classmates, no judgment disguised as curiosity. Just anonymous faces and the comfort of being unseen. She had built a routine here. Sit, eat slowly, read her phone, leave before the after-school crowd thickened. But routines only work until something breaks them. The bell above the diner door rang sharply that afternoon, cutting through the low hum of conversation. Emma did not look up immediately, but she felt the shift in the room, the subtle tightening of attention, the kind that always preceded trouble. She knew that feeling too well. Dylan Sutherland entered first, 17 like her, but carrying himself like someone already convinced the world belonged to him. He was tall, lean, with sharply styled blonde hair and a jawline always angled upward, as if he were permanently looking down at everything around him. His clothes were expensive in a way that didn't need labels. Clean jacket, fitted jeans, shoes untouched by the reality of sidewalks. Behind him followed two boys, Mason Clark, broader and louder, with a permanent smirk and flushed cheeks that suggested he thrived on attention, and Ryan Holt, quieter, but sharper, the type who filmed everything first and questioned it never. Dylan's eyes landed on Emma within seconds. A smile formed, not warm, not accidental, but practiced. "Well, look who's here," Dylan said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. His voice carried that casual cruelty of someone who had never been challenged seriously. Mason laughed immediately, leaning into the moment like it was a performance they had rehearsed. Ryan already had his phone halfway out of his pocket. Emma lowered her gaze to her drink. Her fingers tightened around the plastic cup. She told herself to stay still, stay invisible. That was always safest. But Dylan was already walking toward her booth. "You know," Dylan continued, stopping just beside her table, "it's kind of impressive you still eat here. Like dedication or something." Mason snorted. Or maybe she thinks the booth will get bigger for her. A few people nearby shifted uncomfortably. One woman at the counter glanced over, then quickly looked away. The cashier pretended to reorganize receipts. The silence in the diner did not mean ignorance. It meant avoidance. Emma felt heat rise in her face, spreading from her neck to her ears. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the condensation sliding down her cup. "I'm just eating," she said quietly. Her voice was small, almost lost under the background noise. Dylan leaned closer. His presence filled her space without permission. "Yeah, that's kind of the issue, isn't it?" Ryan chuckled softly behind him, already recording. Emma's thoughts scattered. Part of her wanted to leave immediately, but her body felt locked, as if movement would only make things worse. She had learned over years of situations like this that any reaction became fuel. Mason tapped the edge of her table. "Hey, say something funny. We're bored." Emma shook her head slightly. "Please just leave me alone." That word, please, only seemed to amuse them more. Dylan's expression shifted subtly. Not anger, not even annoyance. Something worse, boredom mixed with opportunity. "You always say that," Dylan said, "and yet somehow you're always where people can see you." He stepped back half a pace, as if giving space, but his posture changed. His foot slid slightly against the floor. It happened fast. A shove, not hard enough to look like violence at first glance, but precise enough to disrupt balance. Emma's chair scraped violently against the tile. Her hand shot out instinctively, trying to catch herself, but the booth edge slipped away too quickly. The sound of her fall was louder than anyone expected. Metal legs hit the floor. Her drink tipped, spilling across the linoleum in a spreading stain of soda and ice. Emma landed awkwardly, her breath knocked out in a sharp gasp that left her momentarily unable to speak. For a fraction of a second, the diner froze. Then laughter erupted. Mason laughed the loudest, bending slightly as if the scene physically delighted him. Dylan smiled faintly, watching her on the floor like a demonstration completed successfully. Ryan continued recording, adjusting focus. Emma's face burned with humiliation. She tried to push herself up, but her hands trembled. Her mind wasn't processing pain yet. Only the overwhelming awareness of being seen, of being exposed in the worst possible way. Not a single adult moved toward her. Not the waitress wiping down a table nearby. A thin woman in her 40s named Carla Jennings, whose tired eyes had long since learned to avoid conflict. Not the man at the counter. Not the couple by the window. Emma realized something in that moment with cold clarity. The fall itself was not the worst part. The silence was. She finally managed to sit upright, her breathing uneven. Her eyes flicked briefly across the room, searching for something, anything, that resembled intervention. Nothing came. Dylan tilted his head slightly. "Careful," he said softly. "Wouldn't want the floor to break next time." Another wave of laughter from Mason. Emma's hands clenched. Something inside her shifted. Not courage yet, not strength, but a thin crack in the routine of submission she had built her life around. And then, as Ryan lowered his phone for a second to check the recording, Emma noticed something strange. A message notification appeared on his screen before he dimmed it again. A group chat. The name was partially visible for less than a second. Sutherland Content. Emma's stomach tightened. She didn't understand it yet, but something about that name felt wrong in a deeper way than the bullying itself. Something organized, something practiced. Dylan straightened his jacket. "Come on," he said to his friends. "We got what we needed." They began to turn away, as if nothing had happened. Emma remained on the floor for a moment longer than necessary, her breathing slowly returning to normal. The diner noise resumed around her, as if the moment had been filed away and dismissed by everyone except her. But as she finally reached for the table edge to stand, she noticed one more thing. The bell above the door rang again, and for the briefest instant, she looked up, expecting nothing, but hoping anyway. Someone had just stepped inside, and the air in the diner changed again. The bell above Miller's diner had not finished ringing when the atmosphere inside shifted in a way no one could immediately explain. It was not noise or movement that changed first, but attention itself. as if the room had instinctively reoriented towards something larger than itself. Rain still pressed against the windows, sliding down in uneven trails, but the warmth inside suddenly felt thinner, more fragile, as though the space had become aware of itself. Emma Parker was still on the floor near her booth, her breathing uneven, her hands braced against the cold tile as she tried to regain composure. Her face was flushed from humiliation, her eyes unfocused, still processing what had just happened. The laughter from Dylan Sutherland and his friends was fading as they moved toward the exit, but the echo of it remained trapped in her chest like something sharp. Then, she saw him. The man who had just entered stood just inside the doorway, letting the door close slowly behind him. Without haste. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the quiet weight of someone trained to read danger before it announced itself. His name was Jake Morrison, a former U.S. Navy SEAL in his mid-30s. His face was angular and weathered, marked by a straight nose that had likely been broken at some point and healed imperfectly, giving him a slightly asymmetrical profile that only reinforced the sense that he had lived through things most people would never understand. His hair was dark brown, cut short in a military style, and a neatly trimmed beard framed his jaw, salt beginning to thread through it in subtle streaks. His eyes were the most striking part, steel gray, steady, and observant, scanning the room not with curiosity, but with assessment. At his side walked a German shepherd. The dog, named Rex, was large even by working line standards, with a dense black and tan coat and alert amber eyes that tracked everything in the diner with disciplined focus. There was a visible scar along his left shoulder, faint but unmistakable, suggesting past injuries from service. Rex did not behave like a pet. He behaved like a partner, staying slightly ahead of Jake's pace, as if clearing space before him. Emma instinctively felt the change in the air before she understood its source. Jake Morrison's gaze had already locked onto the scene near her booth, reading the overturned chair, the spilled drink, the scattered laughter of departing teenagers, and finally, her on the floor. Dylan Sutherland slowed as he reached the exit. He noticed Jake at the same moment, and for a brief second, his confidence hesitated. Mason Clark followed his gaze, his smirk fading slightly. Ryan Holt instinctively lowered his phone, sensing that whatever was entering the room did not belong to their usual world of control. Jake did not speak immediately. He moved forward instead, each step measured, controlled, and silent despite his size. Rex stayed close to his left leg, eyes fixed ahead. Emma tried to push herself up again, but her hands trembled more than before. She felt suddenly aware of how she must look. Spilled drink staining the floor near her, hair disheveled, dignity scattered along with the chair. She expected him to walk past. Everyone usually did. But Jake stopped directly in front of her. Not beside her, not near her, in front of her, where he had to look down slightly to meet her eyes. His voice, when it came, was calm, but carried an unmistakable firmness, shaped by discipline rather than anger. "Are you hurt?" Emma hesitated. No one had asked her that in a way that required honesty instead of performance. She swallowed, trying to steady herself. I'm okay." Jake did not accept the answer immediately. His eyes moved briefly over her posture, her hands, her breathing, the slight tremor in her shoulders. A trained observer would recognize that he was assessing more than words. Rex stepped half a pace forward, then stopped, his head lowering slightly as his gaze locked onto Emma. There was no aggression in the movement, only attention, an almost unsettling focus that made Emma instinctively still. The dog did not bark or growl. Instead, he sat down beside Jake, with controlled precision, as if confirming position. Behind them, Dylan let out a short laugh, attempting to reclaim dominance of the moment. "She's fine," he called out. "She just fell. It happens." Jake's head turned slowly toward the voice. The change was subtle, but immediate. Not anger, not escalation. Something colder, the kind of attention that stripped away noise and left only intention. Dylan straightened slightly, adjusting his stance as if preparing for confrontation. But something in Jake's presence made the air feel heavier than expected. Jake spoke without raising his voice. "Did she fall?" Dylan shrugged. "Yeah, clumsy." Mason added quickly, "We didn't do anything." Ryan lifted his phone slightly again, uncertain whether to keep recording or stop entirely. Jake returned his gaze to Emma. "Did they touch you?" The question was simple, but it carried weight. Emma felt her throat tighten. She had spent so long minimizing everything that even acknowledging it felt dangerous. Her instinct was to retreat into silence again. But something about the way Jake stood there did not allow avoidance to feel safe anymore. Her lips parted. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "He pushed me." The diner did not react immediately. It was as if the statement needed time to travel through the room before it could land. Jake did not look surprised. He looked confirmed. Dylan's expression shifted. "That's not what happened," he said quickly. "She tripped. Jake raised a hand slightly, not aggressively, but enough to interrupt. "I didn't ask you." The simplicity of the sentence silenced Dylan more effectively than volume ever could. Jake turned back to Emma. "Stand up." It was not a command meant to control her. It was an instruction designed to restore her position in space, as if her current state was not acceptable evidence of normality. Rex shifted slightly but remained seated, watching. Emma hesitated, then slowly pushed herself up, using the edge of the booth. Jake did not touch her, but he adjusted his stance subtly, positioning himself so that if she lost balance, she would not fall backward into open space. Only when she was fully upright did he step back half a pace, giving her room without abandoning proximity. His eyes moved briefly across the floor, noting the overturned chair and spilled drink. Then he looked at Dylan again. "Apologize," Jake said. The word landed differently than expected. It was not loud. It was not emotional. It was final, in a way that suggested it should have already happened. Dylan hesitated. Mason looked at him. Ryan stopped recording entirely. Dylan forced a small laugh. "For what? She—" Rex stood up. The movement was immediate, silent, and precise. No growl, no bark, just presence shifting from neutral to alert. His amber eyes fixed directly on Dylan. The shift in energy was enough. Dylan took a half step back instinctively, breaking his own posture. Jake did not look at the dog. He did not need to. "Last chance," Jake said quietly. For the first time, Dylan looked uncertain. Not afraid exactly, but aware that this situation was no longer under his control. The familiar structure of laughter, audience, and dominance had collapsed. He muttered something under his breath. It was not clear, but it was not an apology. Jake nodded once, as if registering the answer. Then he turned slightly toward Emma. "You don't have to stay here." Emma looked at him, confused. "What?" But before she could process further, Jake's attention shifted briefly to the counter area. Carla Jennings, the waitress from earlier, stood frozen near the coffee machine, watching everything unfold with widened eyes. Her tired posture had changed, shoulders tense, hands still holding a rag she had forgotten to move. Jake then looked back toward the exit. Dylan and his friends were already retreating, their confidence broken into uneven fragments. And just as they reached the door, Jake spoke one final time, not to them, but into the room itself. "This didn't happen the way you think it did," he said calmly, almost to himself. "And it won't end here." Emma felt a strange mixture of confusion and relief. She did not yet understand who this man was, or why his presence felt so different from everyone else who had ignored her before. But she understood one thing clearly. For the first time, someone had stayed, and that alone was enough to change everything that came next. The rain outside Miller's diner had eased into a slow, uncertain drizzle, but the tension inside the building had not relaxed. Instead, it had shifted into something heavier, more deliberate, as if the air itself now carried the weight of what had just happened. The neon light outside continued to flicker, casting intermittent red and white reflections across the wet glass. But inside, every movement felt subdued, contained, and watched. Emma Parker remained standing near the booth, her hand still trembling slightly as she tried to steady her breathing. Jake Morrison had not left her side, though he now stood a step back, giving her space while maintaining a quiet presence that felt strangely stabilizing. Rex sat beside him, alert but no longer actively scanning, as if the immediate threat had passed, but the situation remained unresolved. Dylan Sutherland and his friends had already exited the diner, but their departure did not bring relief. It felt instead like the pause before something larger would arrive. Jake knew that kind of silence. It rarely stayed silent for long. Carla Jennings, the waitress, slowly moved back behind the counter, her movements stiff. She was a woman in her early 40s with tired brown eyes, thin shoulders, and dark hair tied into a messy bun that suggested years of working double shifts. There was a softness to her face that had been worn down by repetition rather than cruelty. The kind of person who had learned that survival and service work often meant not seeing too much, but now she had seen enough that her hands could not stop shaking as she wiped the same counter twice without realizing it. Emma finally spoke, her voice fragile. "They're not just going to leave it alone." Jake looked at her briefly. "No," he said simply. "They won't." That answer should have been alarming, but instead, it felt like truth acknowledged rather than danger introduced. What none of them yet knew was that the consequences had already begun outside the diner. Across town, in a high-rise office building with glass walls overlooking the city, a man named Victor Sutherland was already receiving a call. Victor was in his late 50s, sharply dressed in a charcoal suit that fit his tall, lean frame with precision. His silver hair was slicked back perfectly, and his face carried the controlled expression of someone who had spent decades negotiating outcomes before they became public problems. He did not react emotionally to most information. Instead, he processed it like a system failure. The call came from his son's friend. "Sir, there was an incident," the voice said carefully. Victor listened without interruption, his expression slowly tightening as details emerged. A former military man, physical intervention, public embarrassment. Video recording interrupted. When the call ended, he sat in silence for nearly 10 seconds, staring at the reflection of the city skyline in the glass wall behind his desk. Then he pressed a button on his phone. "Bring me everything on Jake Morrison," he said. Back at the diner, Emma sat back down slowly in the booth, as if her legs had finally stopped cooperating. Jake remained standing, now slightly angled toward the entrance, as if he was no longer only part of the situation, but also positioned outside of it, observing how it would evolve. Rex shifted once, then settled again, his gaze still attentive. A few customers had quietly left. Others remained, pretending not to have witnessed anything, though their silence now felt different, less like avoidance, and more like anticipation of fallout. Jake finally broke the quiet. "Do you know them well?" Emma hesitated. "Dylan? He's kind of always been around school. His family is important." The way she said important carried more meaning than she intended. It was not admiration. It was caution learned through repetition. Carla, still behind the counter, spoke without turning fully around. "Sutherland Construction," she said quietly. Her voice was soft, but edged with resignation. "They built half the district, including the school." Jake absorbed that without comment. Emma looked down at her hands. "If they decide I caused trouble, it doesn't end well for me." Jake studied her for a moment longer than necessary. There was no pity in his expression, only recognition of a pattern he had seen before in different environments. Systems where power replaced accountability. Then he spoke. "It's not your job to manage their reaction." Emma almost laughed, but it came out as something closer to disbelief. "It kind of feels like it is." Before Jake could respond, his phone vibrated. He glanced at it. A single notification. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he looked toward the window. Outside, a black SUV had stopped across the street. Emma did not notice it yet. Carla did not either, But Rex had already shifted his posture slightly, ears tightening, attention redirected toward the window without sound. Jake finally looked at the notification. It was not a message. It was a flag from a contact network he still had access to from his service years. A quiet alert indicating that a name he had just encountered was now being searched through multiple private channels. His expression did not change, but something inside his focus narrowed. "They're moving faster than expected," he said quietly. Emma looked at him. "What does that mean?" Jake did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to the window, subtly blocking Emma's line of sight to the SUV outside. "It means," he said finally, "that this is no longer about what happened in here." At that exact moment, inside the SUV, Dylan Sutherland sat in the back seat, his jaw tight, his earlier confidence replaced with frustration. Beside him, Mason Clark scrolled through footage on his phone, replaying the moment Emma fell. Ryan Holt stared out the window, unusually quiet. Dylan's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Stop recording. You don't understand who you just involved." Dylan frowned. "What is this?" he muttered. Mason leaned over. "Probably some random." But Ryan didn't respond. He was still looking at the diner. Inside, Jake stepped back from the window. Emma noticed his shift in posture. "Are they coming back?" Jake looked at her. His voice remained controlled, but now carried a deeper weight. "No, not yet." He paused briefly, then added, "But this is going to escalate." Emma felt a cold pressure rise in her chest. "Because of me?" Jake shook his head once. "Because of what they've been doing, long before today." For the first time, Emma understood that the incident in the diner was not isolated. It was connected to something larger, something structured in a way she could not yet see. Rex stood again, this time without hesitation, and moved closer to Jake's side, signaling readiness rather than alertness. Carla Jennings finally turned fully around from the counter. Her face was pale now, her tired expression replaced with something closer to fear. "You should leave," she said quietly. "If Sutherland gets involved personally, people don't just get sued. They get erased from everything they rely on." Jake met her gaze calmly. "That depends on who's willing to stand still." Emma looked between them, trying to understand the language they were speaking. But before she could ask anything more, the diner's front door opened again. Not slowly, not cautiously. This time, decisively. And the sound of the bell felt heavier than before. The diner was quieter now, but the silence no longer felt natural. It had become something layered, like tension compressed into still air, waiting for pressure to release it. Outside, the rain had almost stopped completely, leaving only wet streets and the dull glow of streetlights reflecting off puddles. Inside, however, the atmosphere had shifted from a single incident into something far more structural, as if the moment in the booth had cracked open a door that had been sealed for a long time. Emma Parker sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, though her fingers still trembled slightly. Her breathing had steadied, but her mind had not. Every few seconds, she replayed the fall, the laughter, and the moment Jake Morrison had simply stood there and asked her a question no one else had ever asked with sincerity. Beside her, Jake remained composed, leaning slightly against the booth edge, his posture relaxed, but never careless. Rex lay at his feet, eyes half open but still attentive, the kind of alert rest that came from training rather than comfort. Carla Jennings stood behind the counter, now more still than before. She was a woman shaped by years of repetitive labor, thin wrists, slightly hunched shoulders, tired brown eyes that had seen too many conflicts avoided rather than resolved. Her gaze kept drifting toward the window where the SUV had been earlier, as if expecting it to return at any moment. Jake finally broke the silence. "You said this isn't the first time," he said to Emma. Emma hesitated, then nodded slightly. "Not exactly like this, but it's not new." Her voice carried hesitation, but also exhaustion. Not just from today, but from years of accumulated experiences that had never fully resolved. Jake didn't press immediately. Instead, he asked a different question. How often? Emma looked down. At school? A lot. Not always me. Others too. But Dylan, he likes to pick people who won't be believed. The words were simple, but their implication was not. At that moment, the front door opened again. Not aggressively this time, but with purpose. A woman stepped inside. She was in her late 30s, tall and sharply composed, wearing a dark gray trench coat over a simple black blouse. Her hair was black, cut into a shoulder-length style that framed a face marked by intelligence rather than softness. Her skin had a warm olive tone, and her eyes carried the steady focus of someone used to observing details others missed. She moved like a person accustomed to entering tense environments without announcing herself. This was Sarah Chen, an investigative journalist known in regional circles for exposing institutional cover-ups. She had a reputation for persistence rather than popularity, someone who followed threads others abandoned. Years of field reporting had given her a controlled demeanor. She rarely reacted emotionally on the surface, but her eyes were always processing. She paused briefly as she scanned the room. Her gaze immediately locked onto Jake, then shifted to Emma, then to the subtle tension around the booth area. Rex lifted his head slightly, but did not stand. Sarah approached calmly, stopping a few feet away from the booth. "Jake Morrison," she said, as if confirming identity rather than greeting. Jake's eyes narrowed slightly. "Sarah Chen." Emma looked between them, confused. "You know each other?" Sarah's gaze softened briefly toward Emma before returning to Jake. "We crossed paths once in Kandahar coverage years ago. Different circumstances." Jake didn't respond to the memory. Instead, he asked, "You here because of this?" Sarah didn't deny it. "I was already tracking something connected to Sutherland construction, school funding irregularities, suppressed complaints, missing disciplinary records." She paused, then added, "Then I saw the video fragments circulating before they got pulled." Emma's body tensed slightly at the mention of video fragments. Sarah noticed immediately. Her tone shifted slightly more careful. "I'm not here to expose you. I'm here because this pattern is real." Jake studied her for a moment. "You're saying this isn't isolated?" Sarah nodded once. "It hasn't been for a long time." She reached into her bag and placed a small tablet on the table. The screen lit up with folders, files, and partially redacted reports. Emma leaned slightly forward without realizing it, then stopped herself, as if afraid of what she might see. Sarah opened a file. Multiple names appeared. Different schools, different towns, same structure, recorded harassment incidents, edited clips, distribution channels disguised as private group content, monetized engagement through hidden accounts. The details were fragmented, but consistent enough to form a disturbing pattern. Emma's voice dropped. "They record it." Sarah nodded. "Not just record. They curate it. They select moments that generate reactions. Then they circulate them in closed networks before they're scrubbed." Jake's expression didn't change, but something in his focus sharpened further. Carla, still behind the counter, spoke quietly without turning around. "People here have been talking for years. Complaints disappear. Teachers transfer. Nothing sticks." Sarah looked toward her. "Because it's protected." Emma felt a cold realization forming in her chest. "Dylan is just part of it?" Sarah hesitated slightly before answering. "He's a participant, but not the structure." Jake looked at the tablet again. "Who's running it?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she tapped another file. A partially visible organizational chart appeared. Names redacted, but roles visible. Coordinators, distribution handlers, financial intermediaries. At the top level, one label stood out even without a name attached. Private Sponsorship Network. Emma felt her stomach tighten. Sarah continued. "It's funded indirectly through construction contracts, donations, and school partnerships. That's why it's difficult to touch. It's layered through legitimate channels." Jake finally leaned forward slightly. "And Sutherland?" Sarah's expression hardened just a fraction. Central node, not the only one, but one of the most influential locally. Carla exhaled slowly, almost as if confirming something she had long suspected, but never voiced. Emma whispered, "So even if I tell someone," Sarah cut in gently but firmly, "they'll try to discredit you first. That's standard procedure." The weight of that statement settled heavily in the booth. Rex shifted slightly, standing now, moving closer to Jake's leg. His posture changed again, less passive, more alert. Something outside had shifted. Jake noticed immediately. He looked toward the window. The black SUV was no longer parked across the street. Instead, it was now directly outside the diner entrance. Sarah noticed his gaze and followed it. Her expression tightened slightly. "They found you faster than expected." Emma's breathing became uneven again. "What does that mean?" Jake stood slowly. "It means they're no longer observing." The front door remained closed, but the presence outside felt closer now. Not visible, but undeniable. Carla stepped away from the counter slightly for the first time, her hands tightening around the cloth she had been holding all night. "If they come in here," she said quietly, "you need to understand something. People here don't testify against Sutherland." Sarah looked at her. "Because of fear?" Carla shook her head once. "Because of consequences." Jake adjusted his stance subtly, positioning himself between Emma and the entrance without making it obvious. Emma looked up at him. "What happens now?" Jake didn't answer immediately. Instead, he listened. The sound of a door outside. Not the diner door, the SUV door. Then footsteps. Approaching. Sarah closed the tablet slowly. "We don't have time for explanation anymore." Jake nodded once. "We never did." The bell above the diner door did not ring yet, but everyone inside knew it would. The diner had long since fallen behind them in both distance and memory, but the consequences of what happened there had only grown sharper with time. In the days that followed, Miller's Diner became a reference point in local news fragments, whispered conversations, and online discussions that never fully captured the weight of what had actually unfolded. But for Emma Parker, none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was the quiet inevitability of what was coming next. The courtroom was colder than she expected, not physically, but emotionally. An engineered coldness made of polished wood, restrained voices, and the controlled rhythm of legal procedure. Emma sat in the witness section, her hands folded tightly together, her posture small but determined in a way that contrasted sharply with how she had been in the diner days earlier. Her hair was neatly brushed now, her clothes simple and clean, chosen not for appearance, but for stability. Beside her sat Sarah Chin, the investigative journalist whose presence had become a quiet anchor over the past days. Sarah remained composed, wearing a dark navy blazer over a white blouse. Her black hair was tied back, revealing a face marked by sharp focus and minimal expression. She carried herself like someone who had spent years in environments where emotion was a liability. Her eyes moved constantly, tracking attorneys, observing jurors, noting reactions. She was not here as a participant, but as an observer who understood how narratives were shaped and dismantled. Across the room sat Jake Morrison. He was dressed simply now, no military uniform, only a dark jacket over a plain shirt. His posture remained controlled, but there was a visible tension in the way he held still, like someone trained not to react prematurely. Rex was not allowed inside the courtroom itself, but Jake's awareness of the dog's absence was evident in the occasional subtle glance toward the door. At the opposing table sat Dylan Sutherland. He looked different from the diner, cleaner, more composed. His blonde hair was carefully styled, his expression carefully constructed into something resembling calm innocence. Beside him was his father, Victor Sutherland. Victor was a man built for control. In his early 60s now, he wore a tailored charcoal suit with a white shirt and muted tie, his silver hair slicked back with precision. His face was angular, his expression restrained, to the point of neutrality, but his eyes revealed constant calculation. Every movement he made seemed measured, as if even his breathing had strategic value. He did not look at Emma. He looked at the structure of the room. The trial began with procedural formalities that felt distant and abstract, but the atmosphere shifted the moment Emma was called to testify. She walked slowly to the stand, each step deliberate. When she sat down, she felt the weight of the room settle around her like pressure. The prosecutor, a middle-aged woman named Laura Mitchell, stood with calm authority. Mitchell had short blonde hair, a sharp jawline softened slightly by years of courtroom experience, and eyes that carried both empathy and discipline. She had spent much of her career handling cases involving institutional abuse, and she recognized the emotional terrain immediately. "State your name for the record," she said gently. "Emma Parker," Emma replied. Her voice trembled slightly, but did not break. Laura Mitchell guided her carefully through her testimony. Emma described the diner, the bullying, the laughter, the moment she was pushed. She did not exaggerate. She did not dramatize. She simply told the sequence as it happened, and that simplicity made it more difficult to dismiss. When the defense attorney rose, the tone changed. He was Jonathan Pierce, a man in his 50s with sharp gray hair, a tailored suit, and a voice trained to sound reasonable, even when constructing doubt. His questions were precise, designed not to attack directly, but to destabilize perception. "You said you were pushed," he began, "but isn't it true you lost your balance?" Emma felt her throat tighten. She had expected this kind of questioning, but preparation did not eliminate impact. Before she could answer, Jake's voice broke the silence from his seat. "Objection," he said firmly, controlled but unmistakably firm. The judge raised a hand. "Sustained. Mr. Morrison, you will remain silent unless called." Jake leaned back slightly, but his eyes remained fixed on the defense table. Emma continued. Then came the video evidence. A screen lowered in front of the courtroom. The footage played. Grainy, but clear enough. The diner. The booth. Dylan's movement. Emma falling. The laughter. The recording angle from Ryan Holt's phone. Now recovered and authenticated. The room shifted. Emma did not look at the screen directly. She couldn't. Instead, she focused on her hands. When the video ended, silence filled the courtroom in a way that felt heavier than any argument. Laura Mitchell stood again. "This is not an isolated incident," she said, her voice steady. "Additional evidence will show a pattern of behavior involving multiple victims and a structured distribution of recorded harassment." At that moment, Sarah Chen was called to testify. She stepped forward calmly, adjusting her blazer slightly before taking the stand. Her presence immediately changed the tone. Less victim testimony, more investigative authority. She did not speak emotionally. She spoke factually, presenting documentation, metadata, and corroborated sources. She described the network, how recordings were circulated, how content was curated, how victims were selected for engagement potential. She referenced financial pathways without sensationalism, connecting institutional funding to protective silence. Victor Sutherland remained still throughout her testimony. Only his fingers moved occasionally, tapping lightly against the table in a rhythm that suggested calculation rather than anxiety. When cross-examination began, the defense attempted to challenge Sarah's credibility. "You're suggesting a conspiracy," Jonathan Pierce said, tone carefully neutral. "Isn't it possible you're interpreting unrelated incidents as connected?" Sarah met his gaze without hesitation. "No," she said. "I'm documenting a pattern that repeats too consistently to be coincidence." Her answer did not escalate. It finalized. Then Jake was called. He stood and walked to the stand with controlled precision. His testimony was brief, but direct. He described entering the diner, assessing the situation, observing Emma on the floor, and intervening only after confirming physical aggression had occurred. He did not embellish his role. He did not attempt to dramatize it. That restraint made his credibility stronger, not weaker. When asked why he intervened at all, he paused briefly. "Because no one else did," he said. The courtroom did not react immediately, but something shifted subtly in posture, in attention, in the way jurors looked at each other. Victor Sutherland finally spoke during recess, quietly to his attorney. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. "This ends now," he said. But it was no longer his decision. When proceedings resumed, the digital evidence was presented in full context. Metadata, deleted file recovery, distribution logs. The structure Sarah had described became visible not as theory, but as architecture. Emma listened as the world around her transformed into something she had always felt, but never been able to prove. The defense's arguments weakened with each piece of evidence introduced. Attempts to discredit witnesses failed under the weight of documentation. Eventually, the judge delivered the ruling. The charges against Jake Morrison were dismissed in full. The courtroom did not erupt, but the silence that followed was different now. It was not avoidance. It was acknowledgement. Further investigation into Dylan Sutherland and associated individuals was ordered. Emma remained seated long after the formalities ended. She did not cry immediately. Instead, she simply sat still, absorbing the absence of accusation for the first time in a long time. Jake approached her slowly after the court adjourned. Rex was waiting outside, visible through the glass doors, sitting in perfect stillness, as if he had never left his post. Sarah stood nearby, already speaking quietly into her phone, likely coordinating the next stage of exposure. Emma finally looked at Jake. "I didn't win," she said softly. Jake shook his head slightly. "No," he replied, "but you weren't erased." That distinction landed more deeply than any verdict. Outside the courthouse, the sky was overcast, but no longer heavy with rain. For the first time since the diner, Emma walked forward without looking down. And behind her, the system that had once defined silence began to fracture under its own exposure. Some stories are not just stories. They are reminders that silence is not the absence of truth, but often the space where truth is being buried. Emma Parker's journey is a reminder that even when the world turns away, even when power protects itself, truth does not disappear. It waits. In a world where people are judged for how they look, how they speak, or how easily they can be ignored, this story shows something deeper. One act of courage can interrupt an entire system of cruelty, not because the world suddenly becomes fair, but because sometimes God places the right person at the right moment to refuse silence. If you are watching this, and you have ever felt unseen, unheard, or pushed aside, remember this. Your value is not decided by those who mock you, but by the truth that God never stops seeing you. And sometimes He sends help in ways you do not expect. A stranger, a voice, a moment of intervention that changes everything. Faith does not always remove suffering immediately, but it ensures that injustice is never the final word. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell your thoughts, because your voice matters more than silence. And if you believe in stories that reflect courage, truth, and justice, subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing more stories like this. May God bless you, protect you, and guide you through every silent battle you face.